again uh, brings us to the subject of Lake County microclimates. You probably, if you've lived here all your life, or at least for a while, you already know that not every place in Lake County has the same climate. Right? It can be drastically different. Whether you live in Hidden Valley is kind of one of the hotter spots, or when you live in Scotts Valley is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, or maybe even Cobb is even colder. So the average last frost date for Lake County is May 15th. But, you know, when you have an average in a county that's as diverse in terms of climate as Lake County, the average doesn't tell you much of anything. It just means that in Lakeport, usually you don't have frost after May 15th if you live in Lakeport. However, I remember planting and blessing celebrations end of May being cancelled because of hailstorms just 4 or 5 years ago. So that's a not infrequent thing that can happen, you know. So just because the last average frost is mid-May does not mean things can't happen after that. It just means they usually don't. The UC Extension Office number for everybody here who doesn't have it is a good number to remember. It's 707-263-6838. This is where our office is.
It's a UC what?
It's the UC Cooperative Extension. That's the office where master gardeners work when they are in an office and not like out here. And so we're not always there, but there's a secretary that will take your, question and your number, and when we come in, we will call you back and answer it. Or most likely she'll email you. So, and then I can send you the link to that weather website. So that weather website is a great one to know for Lake County gardeners, because people who grow grapes really have to know the weather exactly. You know what I mean? They cannot rely on the weather on, CBS or Fox News or whatever. They need to know the details. So they go to this website. And there's many, many weather stations all over Lake County that report to a central location,
So
and
you
the
can click
information.
on where you live to get the specific information?
Well,
or
that
weather
depends. That depends if there's a weather station where you live. You could start one.
I know my neighbors have one.
I know one of my neighbors has one, so there is one pretty close to where I live.
Yeah.
But let me tell you something. I have another neighbor that's only half as far away from me than this neighbor, and the temperature on her property in the winter is 10 degrees colder than on my property, and it's only a mile away. So, you know what I'm trying to say is,
Right.
this is all nice information, but when it comes down to it, you got to know your property. And I would recommend for everybody who is serious about vegetable gardening to keep a diary for your garden. So you know exactly how cold it can get in your garden at any given time. I've had a diary from my garden since 2007 with, every major event recorded, whether it was snowfall, hail, extended rain, extended drought. What did well, what didn't do well, when I planted this, when I harvested that. So this is the only way to really get to know what you can do on your property. And lately, with the weather getting crazier and crazier, even getting news from a reputable and excellent weather station like the one I recommended is often not accurate enough for your particular property. So take all that with a grain of salt, And so what do you do in the end to prevent failure? What I do personally is, when I grow my own vegetables from seed most of the time. Every once in a while I don't get around to it and I buy some, but mostly I grow from seed because it's cheaper. You can grow more for less money. And so let's say I grow 20 or 25 tomatoes. I really only need 10. So what I do when I have the feeling it's probably not going to be any frost anymore, I put 10 of my 25 tomato seedlings in the ground, and I keep 10 in a protected location just in case. Okay? Yeah.
Another thing that kind of interests me, being from a Hispanic type family too. I'm affiliated with the Roman tribe, and Irish and Filipino. But anyways, Dasha, that when you're talking about when you're planting certain things, the different types of fertilizers, right? Because now they're like organic, so it's plant-based, but then there's different animals, right? Does that make a big difference when you dissect the food and you check in? As far as how
which
it
fertilizer
mutates
you
in the
use?
body?
If
I'm
you're
just saying,
using
does it?
animal manure, you're
Like
talking
I
about
got
animal
chickens.
manure. Yeah.
Just a while back, they were squawking, and then boom, they're like, "See, we do a lot of work," and I was like, "Muck, muck,
Yeah.
muck." And then there's
So
no
I'm
eggs.
glad you brought that
but
up.
nobody wants to buy my eggs.
Well, I'm glad
Sorry.
you brought that up in terms of fertilizer.
Rhode Island.
This is not a class about fertilizer, but I am going to go into this little thing because it is important. If you use a manure as fertilizer, either from your own animals or manure that you got from somebody else or even bought maybe, okay? Chicken manure is what we call the hottest manure. That means it has the most nitrogen. It's very, very high in nitrogen when it comes fresh out of the chicken, okay? It's so high in nitrogen that if you put the chicken manure uncomposted, fresh out of the chicken, on your plants as a fertilizer, the excess nitrogen will burn the roots of your vegetables. Okay? Now, however, if you use that same chicken manure and mix it with bedding or straw, whatever, you know, and let it compost for like a few months, then it's perfectly fine to use it as a fertilizer, because then some of the nitrogen has been used up by the bacteria in there, has leached out through water coming on it, you know. So chicken manure, I'm not going to talk too much about it because otherwise we're not going to get through your material. But yes, chicken manure is okay to use if it's composted for a while, not fresh. It's too high in nitrogen. Now, rabbit manure and llama manure can be used fresh without composting. Every other manure has to be composted first, and depending on the animal, it needs various amounts of time composting because it has various amounts of nitrogen. Horses have a very inefficient digestive system, so there's a lot of nitrogen and a lot of undigested wheat seeds left in their manure. So I don't like to use horse manure. Cow manure is good because cows have many more stomachs than horses, which means they digest their food a lot better. So the weed seeds are not viable anymore when they come out the other end. So cow manure is a better idea, but even that has to be composted, you know, in order not to burn the plants, right?
That sounds very
So
nice,
we could spend 2 hours just talking about fertilizers, but we're going to do that some other time.
Oh yeah, I was just asking. Yeah, what you said was you know, do I just
In general, let's just say in general, most manures, except chicken manure, are not complete fertilizers, meaning the only major nutrient in that manure in large amounts is nitrogen. Okay? There's not enough potassium, you know, there's not enough phosphorus in there to give, especially plants where we eat the fruit, such as tomatoes, peppers, squashes. Most of our summer vegetables are technically not vegetables, they're fruits from a botanical standpoint. And fruits need a lot more phosphorus than you get out of manure. So manure is not enough as a fertilizer, with the exception of probably chicken manure, you know? So anyway.
And chicken manure is good to help your compost keep composting during winter because of its heat.
Exactly. So I forgot what I was talking about before we went on this. But this is always happens. We always go on tangents, and it's always good because you always learn something even if you go on a tangent, even if it wasn't, you know, the subject at hand.
We were talking about the diary.
Oh, we talked about the diary. Yeah, I cannot state that enough. Keep a diary. It really helped me to learn how to garden in the county. Here's my diary. Anyway, so seed starting. You have one handout that I gave you that sort of gives you just a rough overview over when you start what in Lake County. One of these is, of course, the Lake County planting schedule. So now we are at the end of May, almost in June. So when you go to that month, you can see what you can still start now. Let's say, for instance, let's take arugula, the first one. Anywhere you see a black field, that means yes, will definitely work. When you see one of those gray striped fields, that means may work, depending on your zone. So arugula can be sowed in March, April, May, June, July, August, and September. Will work.
What's arugula?
Arugula is a bulletproof vegetable in the in the brassica family.
Like a lettuce.
It's something.
Kind of.
It's
want
not
the
really
red one?
lettuce. It
The red?
tastes.
Bitter
No, it
green.
tastes
It's better.
very intense. It's one of those things that you put in your salad, just
Skunk.
10 leaves or so, because it tastes very intense.
Okay.
It's in the brassica family, meaning like the cabbages and kales. So arugula is basically a mini kale that tastes super intense, where you can only eat a little bit. But because it's mini and tastes so super intense, it can take the heat. It's probably the only brassica vegetable that can take a triple-digit temperature and not die. Okay. So yes, you can start arugula now, but I'm not gonna do it because I've OD'd on arugula years ago and I'm tired of it. So basil. May, you can see basil, you go to May, you can definitely still start basil from seed.
Are we gonna maybe do that? Or?
We're gonna start a few things from seed, but first I'm gonna talk a little bit about it, just so you understand that schedule.
okay.
Right. So before we go into demonstration, I want to make sure you understand that schedule. You go to beans is the next one, right? Beans, it'll tell you you can start in April or May. Of course, you can start it later too. The problem with starting, especially pole beans later, is pole beans take a long time to make their vegetative growth, to make the whole plant. So by the time you finally get beans to eat, it will be November if you don't start in May. Do you know what I'm saying? So that's why we say don't start these beans after May or June. This is the end of May, so it'll still count as May. However, if you have a bush bean, and especially the heat-tolerant bush beans, such as the black-eyed peas, is an ideal time to start right now. I don't know if you like black-eyed peas, but this is a perfect time to start black-eyed peas. And you can still start black-eyed peas as early as beginning of July. Like the 1st of July, you could still start some black-eyed peas and still get some food out of it. That's one of the exceptions. It's the most heat-tolerant bush bean, basically. So, in other words, a lot of the vegetables you can start now are the ones that tend to have bigger seeds, interestingly enough, right? Most of the really small seeded vegetables, let's take an example, lettuce has really small tender seeds that dry out instantly. So once it's in the 90s, you're not gonna start lettuce outside anymore. You can still start it inside and then transplant it outside into a shady location, and you can keep it going in the shade. But starting lettuce once it's in the 90s, I don't recommend. Even growing it outside, you have to pick a variety that is heat tolerant. And there are some heat tolerant lettuces that have been developed in the Israeli desert that will withstand triple digits. They don't taste much like the lettuce we know, but they will not bolt. Okay? I've tried it. But mostly the vegetables that can withstand the heat are the ones that tend to have the bigger seeds, because a bigger seed can soak up more water and it won't dry out before it sprouts. It's kind of one of the secrets. So we're talking beans, squashes, summer squash, winter squash, all that stuff you can start now. You can still start beets now. You can still start carrots now, interestingly enough. And one of the best times to start carrots is actually in June, so you can still get a harvest out of them before it gets cold. If you start them earlier, there's some things, if you start them earlier, they tend to bolt, okay? So it's sort of in the middle between a summer crop and a fall-winter crop. So what we're gonna do now, you all understand how to work this schedule, right? So what I gave you also is another handout. It's called Last Planting Dates for Second Season Crops. It makes for different first frost dates in the fall. So let's say you've already had a crop of carrots early in the year. You already pulled them out. And then you want to know if you can sow another crop and get something to eat out of it before the frost hits. So you pick when your average frost date is in your area. Let's say you're in Scotts Valley. Your average first frost date is probably September 20th in Scotts Valley. So you go to September 20th, go down to carrots, and it'll tell you that the latest time you can sow carrots in Scotts Valley and have them still make it before the frost is July 5th. You see how that works? Now, if you live where I live, my average first frost date would be October 30th. So I could sow carrots as late as August 15th and still probably get eating out of it before they freeze. I would probably not do that. I would probably err on the side of caution and start them earlier. But if my first frost comes when it usually comes, which is like beginning to mid of November, of course there's always exceptions, right? Then I could get away with sowing them in August 15th. So this is what that little schedule is all about. It sounds a little technical, but once you play with it, you realize it's. I found out, even before I had that schedule, I found out that the latest time I can plant pepper seeds and still eat peppers before it freezes was end of June, realistically, at my climate. And I'm in one of the hot spots, like Louise. So I can still plant a pepper seed end of June and I will get a pepper out of it before it freezes. But that is sort of I won't get very many out of it because the plant will just start making fruit when it's getting too cold. So needless to say, I usually don't plant a second pepper crop. The only time I will do that is if I really want to have a particular variety and I didn't find the seed earlier than that, then, you know, I could still get away with it. So, to do a little demo now, make it more fun, right? I think that's what you wanted. I grew something specifically for transplanting. And we're gonna start out with transplanting before the seed starting, even though that seems chronologically wrong, but that way I can use the soil for the transplant and then throw it back and use it for the seed starting demo. I only have a little pot of soil here. So what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna move this here so you can see better. I'm gonna move it over here and I'll let you try it too. So the reason I brought these three different things is, and you can take all the tomatoes home if you want. These are all, I don't need any more tomatoes. The reason why I brought these for demo is because the seeds had 2 tags in them and I didn't know which one it was. One is green zebra. That's a medium-sized tomato. That's kind of zebra striped green, very sweet, very good tasting tomato. It's like one of my favorites. The other one is called atomic grape. And the atomic grape is that little, it's a Baker Creek variety. See, it's a little mini pointed cherry tomato that is super sweet, great tasting, but has a very hard skin. You can kind of throw it at a wall and it will not break. So definitely bred for storage. Yeah.
So I know we only got so much time, but like we're talking about, could these plants also be grown like under lights?
Yes.
They could be.
All these plants can be grown under lights.
As long as you have the right climate.
If you have the right lights, no problem. Yeah.
Year round.
Year round under lights.
They don't have like this sense that says, I don't give
No, they are not
that,
picky about
that.
that. So on the label, I put green zebra on one side and atomic grape on the other because I don't know which one it is. So it's a kind of a surprise to me, right? And I brought these 2 different things. I brought tomatoes and then I brought my favorite lettuce. It has a long Spanish name, which I can't remember the whole of it, but the last word is canasta. Okay.
Like the card game?
So I just call it canasta, yeah, but the name is actually much longer. It's like Merviosa de blah 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 canasta. I can't remember. Anyway, so I call it canasta, but this is a nice summer lettuce, or at least into the warm season, because it's kind of a bit crispy, you know, so it doesn't get completely wilty when it's a little warm. Has a good flavor, and yeah, it's just one of my favorites.
Is that like a cut and come again kind of a...
Not really. It's this one is in between those making a head, but I still start out cutting the leaves on the outside first, and then eventually it'll make a head and then you know. It's not a cut and come again, but it's also not a typical head lettuce. So let's put it like that. So I brought them, I transplanted part of it in little pots here, so we can see the difference between the root ball, and part of it I left in the 6-pack where I started it. So you can see, I want to see if the 6-pack ones are root bound or not. This one hopefully is not. We'll figure that out. And the reason why I brought these 2 different things to demonstrate is because normally when you transplant something, when I put that into the bed, just imagine this is the bed, when I put it into the bed, you always want it to end up in the bed where the soil ends up exactly where the soil was in the pot. So you do not want to bury parts of the lettuce in the soil. You also don't want to have parts of the root ball sticking out of the soil. So you want the soil to end up exactly where the soil is right now. That is called the root crown, where the root goes into the stem, it's called the root crown. And that's the case with most plants when you transplant them, but there's exceptions, like everything has exceptions, right? And tomatoes are one of those exceptions. A tomato you can bury up to here in soil and it'll do just fine. Not only will it do just fine, it'll make roots at every one of those nodes. So when you bury a tomato really deep in the soil at transplanting, you actually get it to make more roots and be more stable. Not only can you bury it deep, like if the soil is relatively shallow, you can lay it sideways so that only the tip sticks out like that. Okay, so you could bury that whole stem. If you have a long stem, lanky kind of seedling, you bury the whole thing and only let the tip stick out. However, before you do that, you need to take those off. Why? Because if you don't take them off, if you don't pinch them off, they will rot underground, and the rot can affect the whole root system. So I always have one of those in the garden. You know what that is? It's a nail scissor. And it's a great tool to have, not just for clipping off little seed leaves, but when you broadcast sow things, which we're going to get to later, and then you have 100 seedlings sprouting all too close together, and you want to thin them out, you don't actually want to pull the extra ones out, because pulling the extra ones out is going to disturb the root system of the ones that are still in there, and can actually harm them to the point where they're not going to do well. So instead of pulling them out, you're going to snip all the ones at soil level that you don't like, and leave the other ones, and that's what this is also for. So you plant one of those tomatoes. So let's just look what the root of this looks like. This was fairly recently transplanted, so I hope it's not root bound. So you can see what I'm doing when I transplant. I get this stalk between my fingers. You probably already know that, right? And then I can easily turn it upside down without the plant going anywhere. And I press in here a little bit so that the soil, the root ball loosens itself up the pot. Sometimes you have to press in the top a little bit, depending. Now this thing, you can see, it's not what I would consider root bound, but it's been there long enough to have filled up the area nicely. You see that? It's got roots everywhere, roots on the side, roots at the bottom. This is just starting to become root bound. Do you see what I'm saying here? That is going to start to circle around here. So what I do is, anything that looks like it's starting to become root bound, I'm going to pull this off, open up the root system. And then, like I said, we can bury, in this case, the whole stem a little bit. Okay, sorry, I didn't want to dirty you. So I'm going to put it in here. And you can put a stake in it. I don't have a stake with me right now. In this case, if I bury it like that, I would use a stake to keep it upright. And keep only the portion where the leaves are upright. So we can use this as a stake for now. Sort of. Right? You get the idea. Yeah. Before you transplant something, make sure the soil you transplant in is nice and moist. As moist as a wrung out sponge is the ideal moisture. I remember we had planting and blessing ceremonies here. I wasn't here this year. When the soil in these beds was powder dry, because it was already so hot. It had already been so hot for so long. And then you're forcing this seedling that's already in shock, being ripped out of its pot, is kind of in shock, putting it in powder dry soil. That powder dry soil is immediately gonna wick the last bit of moisture out of the root ball of that seedling if you do not immediately water it in. So not a good idea. Do never plant things into powder dry soil, hi Susan. Always make sure your soil is, if you want to give your seedlings, we're talking now ideal conditions, right? Yeah, I mean under emergency situations, do whatever you have to, but if you can, make sure your soil is, you know, nice and moist. And then you immediately water it in. And I brought my little watering can. This is not something you need for transplants. I brought it for the seedlings because it has a nice gentle rain kind of spout. You're not like gushing a wall of water on your little plant, you know what I'm saying? And that is a mistake that a lot of people make. Mostly for seedlings, but also for transplants. That plant is in stress when it gets transplanted. It needs a lot of care to recover from that. Tomatoes, not so much, honestly. They're pretty hardy, but lettuce is a different story, right? Or other more tender plants. So this is a nice investment to get yourself a can with a nice, you know, rain shower spout, or even the spout on your hose kind of has a good function like that. But it's not one those. You used to have one of those trigger spouts. Is horrible because you press the trigger and then there's a blast of water coming out of it that'll immediately flatten that seedling, right? You don't want to do that, obviously. So I'm taking that tomato out again because we only have this one bed to transplant in. So we're gonna have to unfortunately take it out again, and it's gonna be a little shock, but what can I do, right? Tomatoes are hardy. But you get the idea, right? Now, which other plants? There's other plants that can handle being buried up to the neck in soil. Do you know which other plants can handle that? Cabbage family plants. Kale, cabbage, all that stuff you can bury up to the neck in soil.
How about chili peppers?
No, not chili peppers. Cabbage family. So that's basically kale, kohlrabi, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, you know, all that kind of stuff. They can be buried. As a matter of fact, I have experienced transplanting kale plants, and I had a flat of it, and the flat fell over, and some got buried under soil accidentally, and they lived. I had totally forgotten about them. They got buried upside down under the soil, and they lived. Okay. All of a sudden, they came poking through the soil, and there was a cabbage coming out, right? So there's some plants that you can brutalize and they'll be okay with it, and other plants do not tolerate anything like that, you know? So a lettuce, on the other hand, right? We got a lettuce. Now we do the same thing. I put my fingers so, and then I, you know, loosen that up a little bit here. And you wait for it to slide out. This is an ideal transplant stage, okay? And I would put that in up to exactly where it was. But rather than doing that right now, I'm gonna check the other lettuce that is still in its original 6-pack. And sometimes it's not easy to get these things out of a 6-pack. When you press on the sides to kind of loosen it, sometimes it slides right out, sometimes not. One of the tricks is before you transplant something in a 6-pack, always water it before, so it's nice and moist. You'll see what happens. If the root ball is at all dry, it will not come out. It will stick to the wall. So I watered it last night. I'm hoping it's enough. If not, we'll see. So I'm pressing in there just to loosen it a little bit, pressing at the bottom. And then with a 6-pack, you have to be careful not to have the whole thing fall out, right? We all know that. So I'm gonna gently coax it out of here. Yep, and you know what? And through some miracle, this is actually not root bound yet. Look at it, it's actually doing okay. A lot of the times when you leave it in the 6-pack for as long as I did, you'll see white roots circling around and around and around. And what you have to do in that instance is what I did before, is you just break that circle up before you plant it. When you plant it again, in this case, you want to plant it, you want to make the planting hole exactly as deep as the root ball. And you very gently press it in there, meaning you don't want to compact the root ball, but you want to make sure that it has soil contact. That's the key here. Soil contact is not stomping on it like when you plant a tree. It's just, you know, gently pressing the soil around. And then again, you want to water it in right away. And what I usually do, now this is in the sun, this lettuce shouldn't be in the sun. I grow it in a shady spot. So I usually water, especially when I transplant things, I don't water from the top. I water the soil, because if you water something transplanted from the top, it often falls over and doesn't get back up. It has kind of a shock reaction. So it's better to water the soil. And when the soil is moist enough, the roots will take up that moisture, and the pressure of that moisture traveling up, through the xylem will make the lettuce stand up straight. But the next thing you have to do in this case, with the lettuce being transplanted at this time of the year, let me just wash my hands briefly here. Even though, doing it as gently as we did, we did not prick lettuce out of a big plot of lettuces like they used to do in the old days. I want to show you that simply because this is how things were done 50 years ago. They used to have seed flats like that. They were basically just wooden boxes. This wooden box was filled with soil, and then you would sow, 2 or 3 rows of lettuce plants in there. And then when they were transplanting size, you would have to prick out with a fork or with a dibble, prick out the lettuce and transplant it, usually next thing into a pot or into the ground, depending on whether you want to sell it in a pot or whether it's your own garden. I used to, when I was apprenticing at a nursery way back when I was a young person, this is how we started plants. In flats like that. This was before everything was made out of plastic, And they were reused again and again and again. They were disinfected, cleaned out, disinfected, and reused. And so it was the apprentice's job to, with a fork, prick out carefully the lettuce seedlings or whatever you had, and then plant them usually in a pot because we would sell them. So we would plant. We did have plastic pots to sell things in, but we didn't use plastic flats. So. And this, if you do this for your home use, let's say this is your bed, or this is a growing container, then you could simply broadcast lettuce seeds, not too densely, but, because you don't know if everyone sprouts. And then when they sprout and you realize that you only need half as much, then you come with your little scissors and you snip all the ones you don't need at ground level and leave the rest in there. That's one way to go about it, right? Just so you know, this is how it used to be done. Now, one thing I want to add, and we're not seed starting yet, this is actually transplanting, so it doesn't matter. At transplanting, now, this soil doesn't have any fertilizer in it. I just used regular potting soil. You can, of course, transplant it in soil that already has fertilizer in it, So some soils, I just grabbed this because it was sitting in the office. This says it has up to 3 months slow release plant food in there. So if you plant it in something like that, no need to add fertilizer for 3 months. And after 3 months, the lettuce will be long harvested anyway. So, don't think about it. If you don't have soil that already has fertilizer in it, then you want to fertilize. Talking about your favorite subject, right? So what you fertilize with depends partially on the crop you grow. Those of you who took the fertilizer class from me last year, you know that leafy greens need mostly nitrogen-based fertilizers. They can have a little bit of phosphorus and potassium. They all need trace minerals from compost. So I already mixed some compost in that soil, and I can tell you right now, compost is one of the givens. I'm assuming you have compost in your soil because you need that for 100 reasons that I can only get into the soil class, which we're doing later this year. But I mixed that half and half with compost, and that has enough nutrients for that lettuce except nitrogen. So the only thing additionally what that lettuce plant will need, besides what's in the compost, is nitrogen. So I am gonna water it with a diluted nitrogen fertilizer, and that could be fish emulsion, or some other, or I could put a slow release pellet form nitrogen fertilizer in there, or any nitrogen fertilizer that you want. And in very small amounts, I just add very, very small amounts to the water that I water it with, ever so often, maybe twice a week. And that's all that lettuce needs. Now, if you have a tomato in there, the last thing you want to do is give it a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. That's the main mistake that people make with tomatoes, peppers, and other vegetables that are technically fruits, right? Any vegetable, summer vegetable that's technically a fruit, such as tomatoes, peppers, squashes, etc., we eat the fruit part of the vegetable. So these type of vegetables, they need a lot of phosphorus to make that fruit. And potassium is for the integrity of the cell structure, especially under our heavy-duty sun conditions.
How about calcium?
Calcium also. Calcium is, thank you for reminding me, calcium is one of the 2 most deficient nutrients in Lake County soil. Now, having said that, hardly anybody I know grows vegetables in Lake County soil. We all grow it in containers or boxes with purchased perfect soil. So, whatever is true for Lake County soil is not true for what's in these boxes, because that's not Lake County soil in these boxes. But yes, having said that, it is still true that calcium and nitrogen are the first 2 nutrients to usually become deficient in almost any soil. So that's something you're going to usually have to add. However, as you know, so calcium, before you plant your bed, you want to liberally add calcium either in form of gypsum, which is the cheapest form of calcium, and like Sky Hoyt, one of the market farmers in Lake County, retired now, but used to tell us, he said, you cannot overdo calcium. You cannot add too much calcium, so don't worry about adding too much. You cannot add too much, because the gypsum you put into that bed is being transformed by the bacteria in the soil into a bioavailable form for the plants over the course of years. So that gypsum is not immediately available to the plants anyway. It takes a long time of the bacteria working on it before it is in a chelated form that plants can absorb. So add as much gypsum as you want. I would add a pound of gypsum to every one of those beds, and you cannot go wrong. Then, depending on what you grow in it, let's say you grow lettuce in it, you have enough compost in there that all you need for that lettuce is, after the first month or so, some nitrogen fertilizer. In the first month you need nothing, because there's so much nitrogen in the compost that lettuce will be fine. And you may have even harvested all of it after a month, so you may not need anything. If it's still in there after a month, give it some nitrogen. But if you plant a tomato or a pepper or squash, these things, they only need nitrogen to grow the body of the plant. The tomato needs to first grow its own body before it makes tomatoes. And for growing its own body, the tomato plant needs nitrogen. But the moment the tomato plant has reached the size that you want, you have to stop fertilizing nitrogen. Because otherwise, it's going to just keep making more plant material instead of making tomatoes. And that's the number 1 mistake that new gardeners make. They keep adding nitrogen fertilizer to their tomatoes, and they get these giant tomato plants and no tomatoes, right? So most plants, including tomatoes, start making flowers and fruits when they have a feeling their life is gonna come to an end. I can't express it any other way better, because that's the truth. The moment a plant thinks, I think I'm gonna die soon, it's too hot, that's when it starts to procreate, because it wants to make sure it can preserve its genetics in some form, in the form of seeds, of course, right? So the moment we hit triple digits here, or even the high 90s, they are prompted, the hormones get going in the plant and prompted to make flowers and fruit. And at that point, you cannot give it any more nitrogen, or the fruit production will stop and you'll just make more leafy greens, right? So you want to have a fertilizer that's really heavy on the phosphorus and the potassium. When you buy fertilizer, it comes in bags that has 3 numbers on it normally. And just like you would know it, this one doesn't. But most fertilizers should have on the bag, very visibly, usually 3 numbers. And it'll either say, like with a synthetic fertilizer for lawns, it could say 10-10-10. It means it has 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. Or most lawn fertilizers will say 20-0-0, meaning 20% nitrogen, no phosphorus, no potassium. So those three numbers stand for the three macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. So for your tomatoes, you want a fertilizer where the last two numbers are bigger than the first number, okay? Where there's more way more phosphorus, way more potassium than nitrogen in it. This one, terrible company, they don't even put that on there. I can't believe it. I have to write them. This is awful. Anyway, most fertilizers do have that. So with the lettuce, like I said,
So what did you call the three?
nitrogen,
No, but
phosphorus,
you gave a name. The three.
macronutrients, which macronutrients means the nutrients that your plants need a lot of. Then of course they need lots of micronutrients, but if you put half and half soil and compost in your beds, you get all the micronutrients from the compost. Hopefully, if it's good compost, right? If the compost is only made from Christmas trees, you may not have all the micronutrients in there. So, you know, where you get your compost from makes a difference, obviously. I know the compost you're getting, if it's still the same you used to get, that company actually gives you an analysis of exactly what's in there, which is what I like about them. That's why I buy my compost there too.
Where's that?
It's called Cold Creek Compost. I'm not advertising for them, mind you. We're not allowed to advertise for anybody. But from what I know, this is the only compost company around here that gives you an analysis, a breakdown of what exactly is in their compost. And I appreciate that. And that's why I buy their compost. So, so this is our little lettuce now. And now that we've transplanted it, what are we gonna do? We're gonna shade it with shade cloth, of course, right? So this is shade cloth, you all know that. So what I do, I have a metal grid over my beds, over all my beds, made out of construction panels. Yeah, that material that you see up there. So I have kind of made a metal grid over my beds, and I would just drape the shade cloth over that, and I affix it low-tech with clothespins to that structure, and it works fine, you know? If it's a shady day, I pull it off, but if it's a day like that, it stays on all the time. Over lettuce, you cannot grow lettuce in Lake County at this time of the year without shading. It will not be worth eating. So this is a must. And honestly, after transplanting, I shade all vegetables, even the ones that can take the heat. Right after transplanting, they're kind of in a fragile state. So I give them 2-3 days shade. Even the tomatoes, I give them 2-3 days shade. The tomatoes, actually, no, I'm lying. That's not true. The tomatoes don't get any shade because they are pretty hardy. They can take it, you know. And also mostly because when I transplant things, I don't disturb their root system. If you would pull a tomato out of a flat where it's not already in a container, you know, if you transplant anything in a manner where the root system actually gets disturbed, you have to shade it for up to a week or longer for the roots to recover. And the reason why we like to transplant, you know, from plastic pots is because it leaves the root system relatively undisturbed, which means it doesn't take a week or two for the roots to recover. The plant can immediately get going. So,
So what about there's some containers that they say they biodegrade where you can just plop it into the ground.
right, thank you for mentioning that. I am so happy that you asked all these questions because that makes me talk about things that I would otherwise forget. So keep asking questions. So, give you an example, right?
Can I ask you where you get that shape?
That shade cloth, I think it was Ace Hardware. I
Really?
believe it's an Ace Hardware. I can't swear now, it could be Friedman's, I can't remember.
Okay. And you just drape it over these.
No, not those. See, I use that construction panel, it comes in rolls. The construction panel comes in rolls, it's that wide and like 8 feet long.
Okay.
And I simply bend it into a rectangle.
Even high up here like that? You know, like.
No, it's not that high up.
Oh, okay.
Because I don't use it for tomatoes. I use it for leafy crops that need shade.
Oh, okay. So you're not using it like if you have cucumbers or.
No,
No.
no,
Okay.
we're talking now to shade leafy crops. I make sort of
Oh,
a box
okay.
out of it. You know, I pretty much bend it into a box. Put it on top of the bed like a lid on a box.
Right, and then you put that.
And then I
over it.
drape the shade cloth over it, and I simply attach it with clothespins to the. Now tomatoes that have, I make these same tower cylinders. They don't need shading. I don't shade tomatoes. In the end of the year, like end of July, August, if it gets really bad, I actually have one of those that I put on the southwest side. If I feel that they do need a little bit of shade,
Yeah. What,
I
like
put one of those.
these?
Yeah, one of those on the southwest side, because that's the thing, I can fit over the whole tomato
Yeah.
structures. And I have an old, what used to be a carport. It's an old carport that I transformed into a shade structure for
Yeah.
tall growing plants, and
Yeah,
that works
nice.
really well. So, but back to the question about natural biodegradable pots. This is a great example, right? This is a biodegradable peat pot, and that works really well in locations where it's cool, moist, or maybe even hot and humid. Because what this does is this peat, it wicks soil away from the root ball. It's like a wick. It wicks, the top of it will, if the top of it is even the slightest bit visible above the soil, it'll wick all the soil away from the root ball and evaporate it. So this whole root ball will dry out in a jiffy. You can use it if you completely bury it, but my experience is that I used it for like bigger ones, for melon and zucchini seeds. And at the end of the season, when I took the plants out, some of them had not managed to break up that container. The container was still uncomposted in the soil, and it had restricted the growth of the root system considerably. So the biodegradable thing, it's sort of like, you know, those eating utensils that are supposedly biodegradable. They are under certain conditions, but not under every condition. And the biodegradability of this stuff doesn't seem to work in Lake County. It works in a place like Florida, where, you know, any place that has fungal problems, this will work, because this keeps it on the dry side. So if you live in Germany, like we're talking 30 years ago, where it rained every other day, this was perfect. I used to love those, because the wicking function was actually something that kept it from getting a fungal disease. So I really like those. But in Lake County, that's exactly what you don't want, you know? And then there is, so like I said, everything that's marketed to you as a great solution is a great solution somewhere, but not everywhere. Just keep that in mind. So when you watch Pinterest or YouTube and you have these fantastic ideas, you know, like vertical walls of pallets with lettuce growing in there, you can do that in Lake County in February, March. And then April, the moment it goes into the 90s, forget that. This is not going to work here. You're going to have to basically put your garden hose there and leave it there in order for this to stay moist, you know. And the same is starting seeds in those. Yeah, Florida, hey, yes. Lake County, well, the seeds that you start in January, February, like, you know, brassica family things in January, February, you can do that. But now at this time of the year, never ever would I start anything in one of those things, because it dries out. Yeah.
What about newspaper pots? That was a thing
Yeah.
for a while.
Thanks for mentioning that. Newspaper pots are much better than those because they rot faster. When you plant things in newspaper pots, they actually have a tendency to fall apart, even in Lake County, provided you keep the soil nice and moist all the time, especially in the beginning. Because remember, composting can only happen with sufficient moisture, so you cannot let those dry out. I had a flat of newspaper pots with seedlings in it that I forgot about and left it on one of my gardening shelves. I came back to organize my shelf 3 years later. This was outside in the weather, 3 years. Those newspaper pots had not fallen apart after 3 years outside.
Yeah.
And there was no glue in there. I mean, other than the glue that's in the newspaper, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh my
I didn't glue it, I just rolled them up. They were intact after 3 years of going through all of summer, winter, and everything outside on an old potting soil. So that just tells you that in order for this stuff to fall apart and let the roots expand, it needs to be moist at all times. Otherwise, that will not happen. then the other place where you can, this is actually made for cloning cuttings. It's not made for seeding really, but you could conceivably, it's rock wool. This is rock wool. And it's been made for growing marijuana clones mostly. But the nursery industry does use it to clone other plants in it. I mean, we used to use those in it. They used to be made out of peat first. Before they used the rock wool, where do I have the peat? I can't find it right now, but these are available out of peat moss too. They look like little lentils, and then you pour water on it, and then they expand and pop up into a cylinder. And you put them into a tray of water. They soak up as much water as they need. And you could either put the seed in that little hole in the middle. See that? Mm-hmm. This will be a little bigger once it has soaked up water. Or you could put a cutting in there. It's a great way to propagate asexually from cuttings. But you can do seeds. Now my experience has been, I purchased a bunch of those and tried to start seeds in it and did not read the whole pamphlet that came with it. And nothing came up, right? Even though I kept it moist. And then after nothing worked, I read the whole booklet, and it turns out that this has a very either alkaline or acidic pH. I think it has an excessively alkaline pH. And you need to actually add some vinegar to your water in order to balance out the excess alkalinity before you can use it for seed starting. And I didn't read that. So I just added regular water, and of course nothing came up, you know. And I don't know if it was only that particular company stuff or if that's the case with, you know, every rock wool product. I can't tell you. It depends on what kind of rock it's made out of.
So if you
right?
wanted to root a cutting, how would you root a cutting?
So a cutting, you would cut the cutting just like you normally do. Mm-hmm. You cut it right under a node, okay? Dip it in some rooting hormone, and then put it in that thing that's soaked with water, sitting in a tray of water, right? That's where you put it in.
So that might work with a cutting.
Yeah, with a cutting it works fairly well. And then you need one of those plexiglass domes over it to keep it moist, obviously. You know, you have those trays that have little plastic domes over it. That's what it's really best for. And like I said, you can do seeds in it, but I don't find it the best. It's not the best solution for starting seeds. But if you live in an apartment in New York and you don't have any soil, you could conceivably do that. So this was just to the question of, you know, naturally biodegradable pots, right? Did I answer that question fully? Mm-hmm. Okay. And then I almost forgot. The moment you seed or plant something, in this case we already have the label, so I would just stick the label right next to it. But if you transplant from a whole flat where there's only one label in the flat, do never forget to label your thing. As you can see, these ended up with 2 labels, and sure enough, I didn't know anymore which one it was, because tomato plants look the same. You cannot tell by looking at the plant what kind of tomato that is. At least I know it's one of those 2. That's better than nothing, right? But, you know, the bottom line is label everything, even if you think you will remember. I always think I'll remember, and I never do. So you always have to label it. And what needs to go on the label, that depends on how good of a gardener you are. Like for instance, I know this is a tomato, so I don't have to write on the label tomato. I can see it's a tomato. So all I write on the label is the variety of the tomato. Sometimes I write on it what company I got the seed from. I sometimes do, because sometimes I actually have two seeds from 2 different companies, and I want to see which one is better. So in that case, I might want to write the seed catalog company on there. I usually write the year on there, you know. Anything that I think I need to know later, I write on there. But if nothing else, just write the variety on there. That's the minimum I write on there, like early girl or green zebra or whatever. That's the minimum you need to write. So for me, all I need to write is green zebra, because I know it's a tomato. But for a new gardener who doesn't know what tomato plants look like, you need to write tomato green zebra, obviously, right? So, labels. And, you know, I buy them in large amounts because I grow my own seed, but you can repurpose many things. Where do I have my
Popsicle sticks are really good.
Yeah, popsicle sticks, you know. Then there's the real fancy, I mean, for bigger plants. There's all kinds of labels you can buy, fancy or not so fancy, you know. We had a master gardener who had a whole bunch of old blinds. So her husband cut up the old
That's a good idea.
blinds and made labels out of it. They were fantastic, super durable. So, you know, once you look around what you have lying around the house, you make it very creative of what you can make labels out of. Seriously. So
I find
was,
that
was
popsicle
one good
sticks,
thing.
though, if I water them from above, it'll rinse the lettering
Yeah.
off.
Oh, thanks for mentioning that. Here's
Okay.
another important thing. Right? On these particular plastic labels, that doesn't work on every material, but on this particular plastic label, pencil is the best thing to write. It will not get washed off ever.
Oh, nice. Okay.
You
good
wouldn't
to know.
think so, but pencil will be on there forever. If you put a black marker on there, it will get washed off. And the problem is not only will the marker get washed off and you don't know what it is anymore. I noticed that when the black marker gets washed off, the toxic black ink that seeps into the pot will actually kill your plant sometimes.
Uh-oh.
So I use pencil most of the time. Now on wood, this morning I used black marker just because I knew they wouldn't have to live for very long, these labels. And I couldn't find those this morning, so these were the ones that were laying there and I used the black marker on it. But these I always write on with pencil. You know, a sharp pencil. The good thing is you can erase it again and write something else on it and reuse it. But pencil is just the most durable. A number 2 pencil is the most durable thing. Okay.
That's good to know.
Now one more thing I was gonna say. I don't have my tool. Where's my little? Got too many things, then I can't find them when I need them. Huh? Oh, do you know what a dibble is? This is a spoon, but the back of the spoon looks like most dibbles look like, right? That's something you can use to gently tease out roots that you don't want to use a fork and accidentally hurt. So, you know, something that has an end like that. In this case, maybe you have a spoon like that. I use a lot of my kitchen utensils. I brought you something else. The reason why I usually don't start things in pots like that is because they're almost impossible to get the stuff out of without breaking the pot.
You can't squeeze it.
I mean, they're beautiful. I love clay pots, and I often get them for free, you know, from people who don't want theirs anymore. But when you put something in a clay pot, you better be prepared to smash that pot if you want to transplant it, because most of the time you will not get it out any other way. So just keep that in mind. So for things that you start specifically for transplanting, I prefer plastic pots. And these plastic pots, I use 10 times. I've had most of those for like years, because I just keep, after I use them, I wash them out. And before I use them, I usually just dip them in a bleach solution, like water with 10% bleach, and you just kind of dip it in there and let it dry. And that'll take care of, you know, usually I don't have much diseases in my garden, honestly. But if you get them from somewhere else, you never know. So dipping them in a bleach solution after washing them. Now don't dip them in a bleach solution when all the dirt is still sticking in there, you know what I mean? It has to be clean already in order to be able to disinfect it. So I first wash them out really good, let them dry, and then before use, just, you know, dip it in a bleach solution. And that way you can use these things for years. So I think that's enough on the transplanting subject. Anybody have any questions about